Psalm 71 is very likely a continuation of Psalm 70. Well, we'll notice a lot of the similar language with the two Psalms, and we recognize that this Psalm is untitled, which is kind of unusual in Book 2. There are only 3 other Psalms that are untitled in this book, and so it makes a lot of sense to combine these two together, and we can only guess the editor's motivation for dividing this into 2 Psalms, that it just might have something to do with the overall structure and symmetry of it. The occasion for this psalm is pretty clear. It is David is in old age. He's describing his life. He's old, he's gray. He reflects back on his youth, and you might think of this psalm as perhaps one of David's final psalms, his last psalm. We can't prove that. He doesn't say this is the last psalm I've ever written, but we know pretty clearly that he wrote this in his old age, and we know that the next psalm, Psalm 72, is a psalm of Solomon, his son, and his glorious reign. And so we come to the end of the life of David, perhaps here, with Psalm 71. There is an element of lament to the psalm, but it is more so a song of testimony and triumph of how God has delivered him and has been faithful to David in his life. The psalm begins with a series of requests. Lord, I take refuge in you. Don't let me be put to shame. Deliver me, rescue me, incline your ear, save me. Just a series of petitions. Rescue me from the hand of the wicked, from the grasp of the unjust and cruel man. David was a king. He was involved in politics, and when you're in politics, there's always someone who wants to destroy you. And so David, no doubt, even in his old age, as secure as he might have been, he had recently experienced a coup from his own son, and so David probably never trusted anyone very well after that season. Perhaps that request is reflective of that here. His confidence is very strong in verses 5 through 8. You're my hope, you have been my trust from my youth, from before my birth, from my mother's womb. So we've seen this before, Psalm 22. We'll see it in Psalm 139. David's lifelong knowledge of God is referenced there. Verse 7, I have been as a portent. A portent means a sign that could be a sign of blessing or a sign of curse. David has been a significant figure in the life of the nation, and he sees himself as an example to the nation. I've been a sign to many, and you are my strong refuge. My mouth is filled with your praise, with your glory all the day long. This phrase, all the day, will occur 2 more times in this psalm, giving it a type of unity. We also see a pattern here of the number of verses in each of these sections, so observe that as we move through this psalm as well. 5 verses followed by 4 verses. And notice I'm going by not the way they're numbered here. The numbering, of course, came much, much later. The original psalm would have been 5 verses here, followed by 4. Moving ahead, we notice in verse 9, do not cast me off in the time of old age. And so this again suggests that David is old, that his strength is spent. Again, he could be young and he could be thinking toward the future, but the totality of the psalm suggests David is old at this point. He's still got enemies who are trying to overthrow him. And so there's the complaint in verses 10 and 11. And we see the similarity here in verse 12 and 13 with the previous psalm, with Psalm 70. Hurry up and help me. Don't be far from me. And then a prayer of cursing on his enemies, very much like the first 2 verses of Psalm 70. And these 5 verses then are followed by a singular verse that perhaps could be identified as the central theme or central verse. I will hope continually. I will praise you yet more and more. I love this idea that if this is David at the end of his life, his desire is to praise God even more and more. I want to praise you even more. Even as I am old and my strength is spent, I want my worship to become more robust than ever, even in my old age. And so he vows to praise. I will tell of your righteous acts, the deeds of your salvation. When? All the day. For their number is past my knowledge. I can't even remember, God, all the things that you've done for me as I look back on my life. Mighty deeds of the Lord I will come. I'll remind them of your righteousness, yours alone. From my youth you've taught me. I'll proclaim your wonderful deeds. So even to old age and gray hairs, O God, do not forsake me until I proclaim your might to another generation, your power to those who are to come. David understands that his responsibility as an older believer is to speak of what God has done to the next generation, to pass his faith along to the next generation. That's his obligation, his responsibility, and his purpose at this point, and hence this psalm of testimony. And so he gives his testimony. He says, "Your righteousness, O God, reaches the high heavens. You who have done great things, O Lord, who is like you?" God desires and demands our exclusive worship. There is no one like him. And even though God had made David see many troubles and calamities, and notice the causative there, that God caused this, God made this happen, allowed this to happen, David had also experienced revival, refreshing, renewing time and time again. And ultimately, I believe he understands he would receive resurrection, that he would dwell in the presence of God, that God had brought him up again and again from the depths of the earth, and you will bring me up again. I think David is thinking here at the end of his life, he's thinking to the life beyond the grave. The vow to praise continues. I'll praise you with the harp, your faithfulness. I'll sing praises with the lyre, O Holy One of Israel. My lips will shout for joy. I'll sing praises, my soul also, which you have redeemed. And my tongue will tell of your righteous help all the day long. There's that phrase once more. But they've been put to shame and disappointed who sought to do me hurt. And so the psalm concludes, perhaps the final song of David. And I have to say that my hope is that if I live to be old and gray, as David did, that I will have the same kind of energy and passion for worship. I think of the character in the Chronicles of Narnia, Reepicheep, the mouse, the smallest of the characters, and yet the one that had the biggest heart. And his desire was to worship God, to follow Aslan to the ends of the earth and beyond. And I hope that's the case with me, that when I reach the end of my days, that I am singing and shouting and praising God all the day long to the very best of my ability, affirming his faithfulness, his righteousness to the next generation.